It's astonishing. All this is only 20 or 30 minutes from the heart of San Francisco. Not a human habitation in sight anywhere. I've been living out here for some months to write and to absorb an atmosphere that is different from the city, to try and find out what is the essential difference between the world of nature and the world of man. Because there's an obvious difference, like the difference of artistic styles, between the things that human beings do and the things that nature does, even though human beings are themselves part of nature. On the one hand, nature is wiggly. Everything wiggles. The outlines of the hills, the shapes of the trees, the way the wind brushes the grass, the clouds, the tracks of streams. It all wiggles. And for some reason or other, we find wiggly things very difficult to keep track of. Human beings are just as wiggly as nature, and our brains are an incredible mess of wiggles. And that's the part of ourselves that we understand least of all. Each one of us, not only human beings, but every leaf, every weed, exists in the way it does only because everything else around it does. In other words, there's a relationship between the center and the circumference, which is rather like the relationship between the poles of a magnet. Without the center, no circumference. Without the circumference, no center. And although we say of poles that they're the poles apart, that is to say, extremely different, there's something between them, just as the north and south poles of a magnet are united by the magnet. So the individual and the universe are inseparable. But the curious thing is that while that's rather easy to see in theory, very few people are aware of it in an important, strong way, like one is aware of blue in blue sky or of the heat in fire. It's more of an idea than it is of a realization.
I suppose most of you have heard of Zen. But before going on to explain any details about it, I want to make one thing absolutely clear. I am not a Zen Buddhist. I am not advocating Zen Buddhism. I'm not trying to convert anyone to it. I have nothing to sell. I'm an entertainer. That is to say, in the same sense that when you go to a concert and you listen to someone play Mozart, he has nothing to sell except the sound of the music. He doesn't want to convert you to anything. He doesn't want you to join an organization in favor of Mozart's music as opposed to, say, Beethoven's. And I approach you in the same spirit as a musician with his piano or a violinist with his violin. I just want you to enjoy a point of view which I enjoy.
Alan Watts, comment peut-on vous définir?
How do you bite your own teeth? Really, I don't know who I
Je
am.
ne sais vraiment pas qui je suis.
Because
Je pense que
I
chacun
do
d'entre nous
feel
représente
that every one of us,
fondamentalement
basically
l'énergie de tout
the energy of the
l'univers.
whole universe. We had a false sense of our own identity. That we experienced ourselves. My mother had a big collection of Chinese art. This room is surrounded with parts of her collection of Chinese embroidery. And so as a child, I was fascinated with this art which was different from our art. It had a different view of nature, different way of looking at flowers and trees and water and birds and butterflies and people. So as a child, I was fascinated. Now, it so came about that when I was about 10 to 11 years old, I began to read thriller or mystery stories written by such people as Edgar Wallace and Sax Rohmer about sinister Chinese villains. You remember Dr. Fu Manchu? And there were all sorts of others like that. Strange, exotic figures who kept knives in their sleeves, who had ivory boxes full of the strangest poisons, but at the same time who had a kind of urbanity. And whereas other children at that time of life wanted, when they grew up, to become engineers driving trains or sports car champions or whatever it was, I wanted to become a Chinese villain. And so, just as every child at that time of life decorates their room with the things they're interested in, I became fascinated with the forms and the feeling of Chinese and Japanese art. And I still can't quite explain what it is, but it caught me. When I was a small boy, I used to haunt that section of London around the British Museum. And one day I came across a shop which had a notice over the window which said philosophical instruments. Even as a boy, I knew something about philosophy, but I couldn't imagine what philosophical instruments could be. So I went up to the window, and there displayed were chronometers, slide rules, scales, and all kinds of what we would now call scientific instruments, because science used to be called natural philosophy. Because, as Aristotle says, the beginning of philosophy is wonder. Philosophy is man's expression of curiosity about everything, his attempt to make sense of the world primarily through his intellect. That is to say, his faculty for thinking. I was at that time in school at Canterbury, right under the shadow of the cathedral, which is the center of the Church of England. But that wasn't my religion. And so at the age of 15, I announced in the midst of this great cathedral that I was a Buddhist. And the British are very tolerant of eccentricity. They said, "Jolly what, the man's a Buddhist." Of course, subsequently, in the light of Buddhism, in the light of Hinduism, I restudied Christianity and found it wasn't at all the sort of thing that had been presented to me as a boy. I found that out later, and so for a while became an Anglican priest.
But in those days, being an Anglican priest somehow was not my proper role. So I just had to decide to go it alone and do my own thing. Of course, the knowledge of Eastern methods and ideas in the West is not much older than 100 years. I hesitate, therefore, to predict what course they will take. It's like you thought that something out there was a flat disk and you suddenly discovered it was a ball. And so we're only just watching the beginnings of these influences.
I should perhaps say how my interest in calligraphy started. There was a well-known Japanese painter called Saburo Hasegawa who had been in New York. He'd been a great friend of Franz Klein, and he was scheduled to talk at the Asian Academy. And Alan Watts, who was then the dean, telephoned to me and said a Japanese painter's arriving and he's going to stay for a week, and would I look after him? And the next day I met Hasegawa and I took him for a walk in Muir Woods. And we walked for 2 hours. He didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. When we came back, I said, would you like to go and have some lunch in my house, or would you like to go to my studio? And Hasegawa said, I'd like to go to your studio, which was on board a ferry boat, on board a ferry boat at that time. So when we got on board, he looked around, and looked at the floor and everything, and he indicated that he would like to do some calligraphy. And he started clearing the junk away and prepared a beautiful little place. And then he made a few characters. He made the character for infinity. And we had a wonderful session. He wrote the Japanese alphabet, and it was a memorable occasion. And we had tea. And he had a little 3/4 size tea ceremony kit, which was called a mountain water tea ceremony kit, one to take on picnics. Mountain water, I believe, means landscape.